Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode here at amazic.com, where we talk to leaders and influencers from the Kubernetes and the cloud native space about what they're working on. So you get to hear really straight from the trenches of what's happening in this space. And in case you are just tuning in for the first time, I want to encourage you to go and check out all of our other video interviews that we've done over the past few months. There's many of them. So just head over to amazic.com. That's amazic.com. And you'll find all of our videos and a whole bunch of other stuff like articles and event coverage and all of that. So that's a place you want to go to really catch up with all of your news, the Kubernetes and the cloud native space. Today we've got a special guest with us. We've got Patrick Bergstrom, who is the CTO of StormForge. And he is going to be talking to us today all about Kubernetes and especially about optimizing it at scale. So that's going to be our topic for today. Pat, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, Pat. So if you could get us started with just telling us a bit about yourself, your journey up to now, your role as CTO at StormForge, what you've been doing before this, and how you got here. That'd be a great starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a fairly unique background, I'm told, when it comes to tech, but I feel like for everybody that says that, almost everyone has their own unique story and path to how they got to where they are, right? Like most people, I started in tech when I was very young, which, in high school, I wrote my own bash scripts to quiz myself on subjects I didn't really like as much, like, math and stuff like that, which was kind of weird. And then I got my first taste in tech at a professional level. Actually, when I joined the military, I worked on hardware that was responsible for avionics systems in helicopters, which was really fun. From there, I actually joined Best Buy, and I worked at Best Buy corporate for about 12 years. I was with Best Buy in total, and I ran towards the end there, I ran the site reliability engineering team for bestbuy.com. And so back then we were dealing with like EC2 instances in the cloud and all of that fun stuff. And so I feel very fortunate that I've always been like kind of that cloud first environment. And it's funny because when I first started having conversations with StormForge, it actually reminded me of my time at Best Buy and some of the challenges that we were having with, scaling instances and all of that fun stuff. And I think one of the first things I said to Matt, our CEO, was like, where have you been all my life, right? Like I've needed this for a decade now, but we'll get to that. After Best Buy, I joined United Health Group, the technology division of United Health Group known as Optum Technology. And my most recent role there was I was a vice president of site reliability engineering and then enterprise operations. So that included a software development arm. It included a machine learning arm. It included monitoring and SRE and all kinds of fun best practices around, things that we do in the cloud, and then physical on-prem data centers, which was actually relatively new to me at the time. When I first joined that organization, they were telling me about the mainframe in the basement, and that kind of like made me pause, and I was a little nervous about it. But no, it was a really great exposure to just about every technology that you can imagine. And then from there, I have, at that point, I had almost 20 years of experience in the enterprise, and I knew that I was ready for something a little bit different. So I started kind of poking around some startups and seeing who was doing things that were interesting. And StormForge came across my desk because one of our employees at our startup actually lives in the same small town in Iowa that I do. So we went out and had a beer, and he told me all about what he was doing. And I said, that sounds awesome. Like I would love to talk more about that. So from there, the rest is kind of history, as they like to say. I've been here for, I think, going on 7 months now, and it's been a wild ride, and it's fantastic. I love it.
Wow, that's an awesome summary. It sounds like it must have been exciting days. I mean, especially those early days of AWS. Those are probably like a decade ago when AWS was just getting started. Yeah. Any memories from those times of like, you were saying you had this aha moment after you joined StormForge, but then can you tell us a bit about, what was it like back in the day? What was scaling back in the day?
Well, it's funny, especially as you compare your mean time to scale is one of the metrics that we care about a lot, right? Like, especially when you're talking about well, with bestbuy.com in particular, we would have instances where we knew that we had to scale up and be ready for it. So things like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Thanksgiving Day, all the obvious ones. But my favorite was always the ones that were unexpected. And so within SRE, we had all of the metrics that monitored everything that everybody was doing on the website. And so we could kind of get a feeling for how our, customers were engaging with us and what was happening. And we always had a rule around marketing in particular. And anytime they were going to launch something, they had to tell us. And we always had this rule around like no scheduled start dates, right? Like you're never allowed to schedule a start date for anything, because back then you couldn't just respond to it as fast as you can today. Mean time to scale back then for like an EC2 instance was like 5 to 6 minutes to get it fired up and ready if it wasn't already pre-warmed. But towards, I think it was like 2015, 2016, Nintendo released these little things called amiibos that were like part of, I don't even remember the game platform that it was back then, but they were these little collectible figurines that like actually interfaced with the game. And they always went like wildfire. And so it was funny because there was a solid 9 months there, I think, where anytime our orders per minute just skyrocketed. It's like, okay, like let's find the amiibo. Where is it on the website? And then we would react to it, obviously, very quickly to scale up to make sure that our cart system and our checkout system were ready and they could take the traffic. And the infrastructure team, the cloud ops guys on bestbuy.com and the operations group, they were so amazing at their job. I don't think that we ever really had an outage related to one of those unplanned notices or one of those unplanned sales that kind of took off like that, because they were always ready for it. And they were always incredibly smart and really good at their jobs.
Wow, interesting. But we've obviously come a long way since then. And so there's containers, there's Kubernetes since then. And now when we talk about scale, like you said, it's no longer minutes. Now we're talking about, we can scale in seconds, really hyperscale. So, but still there's challenges when it comes to scale. And I'm sure you've seen, your fair share of it. Even today, you see a lot of organizations struggling with scaling Kubernetes. Could you talk a bit on that? What do you see when you look at organizations that really want to scale, really fast, this, really short mean time to scale? When they're aiming for that, what do they struggle with? What are they facing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple different things that kind of go into, what it takes from a mean time to scale perspective. And while the mean time to scale number is important, I think it's almost more important that you know how your application behaves in that instance and what you can expect when you are trying to do something like scale out, right? There was a recent study that Datadog did where they found that less than 1% of customers or users who use Kubernetes used the VPA. And I think the number was it was a little bit better, like something like 40% for customers that use the HPA. And it's really interesting because, Kubernetes we find that it has these systems and these capabilities built in to support things like bursty workloads where you can, automatically scale horizontally to add additional compute if you need to. But I think that we find that the level of complexity and the knowledge that it takes to actually be able to execute that in a way that's successful, the bar is actually pretty high for that. So if you have a smaller cluster where maybe you're running 20 to 50 namespaces or workloads, and you can take the time to configure that and you can tune it and tweak it and make sure that you're in a perfect configuration. But there's so many variables that go into that. Even with just a few namespaces, it very quickly becomes almost impossible to do it by hand. Let alone when you start talking about at the enterprise, right? So you have a namespace in the numbers of like tens of thousands running across a couple dozen or maybe even 100 different clusters. And so that's one of the things where StormForge first told me their mission statement, and I just immediately latched onto it because that's an environment that I come from where, you might have 10,000 namespaces, and sure, you've got Kubernetes expertise that can manually tune and adjust those. But the amount of time it takes to get through all of them and then circle back around to start again is just, it's almost impossible. Like when you talk about the human scale factor, like you can't throw enough bodies at that. And even if you could, if you told me that my full-time job was to come in and just tune Kubernetes all day long to configure the HPA, I would tell you no, hard pass, right? Like nobody likes that level of toil. And so that's what StormForge does. And that's where we come in because It's one thing for like the horizontal pod autoscaler to automatically scale. And I actually saw a great tweet on this today, but like it's not actually automatic, right? Like it takes a lot of configuration to do it right. And so when you can layer in something on top of that, like what we do with our machine learning algorithms, where we can actually automatically configure your VPA, and then your HPA at the exact same time. We just announced today we do bidimensional scaling now. You can use the VPA and HPA together. That's huge. That's a game changer for organizations like that. You no longer have to throw people at that problem, and you can have them focus on the tasks that they actually enjoy, like, writing code and solving bigger problems versus just tuning applications.
All right, all right. Wow, you packed a lot into that. I was going to slowly unpack it and get to the the bidimensional part at the end, but yeah, we already
Yeah.
got to it right at the start. But
We can skip that for a few minutes too. We can circle back on it.
yeah, sure. But I want to just take it a few steps back and talk about how, so there's the big cloud vendors, the AWS and the Azure. So they've got their own managed Kubernetes services, and they talk about how, it's easy to scale. And in fact, Fargate, that's pretty much the promise. You don't have to manage the underlying Kubernetes instances. You just run your applications. So it's kind of like blending serverless and Kubernetes. So in a way, maybe the industry is moving in that direction. But, do you see that, we're not there yet? Do you think that's not reality? If people are to assume that, by just using EKS or Fargate, their scaling issues are just going to go away. Is that a myth that people sometimes buy into?
Yeah, I do think that for the most part, that is a myth in a lot of ways, right? Like it's one thing to talk about serverless, where you look at a service like Lambda, for instance, where you just throw your code at it and it will execute exactly how it needs to. Your build for exactly what you consume, and then that's it. But for EKS, like sure, it's easy to scale horizontally, but you still have to know what those scale points are, right? And you still have to know exactly how big should my pod be when I first deploy this thing, and how does that relate to my traffic patterns? And we talked a little bit about mean time to scale, for instance. If I know how long it takes me to scale out horizontally and add additional replica sets to my application, one of the things that's really important for me is to know when to trigger that scale. And so like that's the biggest thing with the HPA is, what is my scale point? If I set it too low, then I'm wasting resources and I'm adding a ton of replicas when I don't need to. But if I set it too high, then it doesn't give my HPA enough time to absorb the traffic that's coming on by having those replica sets available to take traffic, and I cause customer impact. So it's easier than it used to be when it comes to like scaling horizontally, right? But I think that we're not there yet to where it's like fully automatic and we didn't just deploy code and be done with it and not have to worry about it. And it's one of those things also where, especially when we talk about like applying compute and memory configurations to an application, there's competing factors in organizations that are fighting over which way that dial goes. If you talk to an SRE, they're going to try to add as much CPU and memory they can, because CPU and memory equals availability, it equals performance, and it equals fast response times, and every customer gets happy. But then when you look at the bill at the end of the day, the CFO is going to say, well, hang on a second, like I'm not okay with spending this, right? And that's kind of that promise. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people are realizing now that the cloud is not cheaper, right? Like the cloud has the capability to be cheaper if you configure it correctly and you keep your overhead as low as possible. But the amount of effort it takes to keep that overhead low is not insignificant.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point that I want to really dive into a bit more. And, I think even especially coming from like the old school of just running VMs in the cloud, I think people have definitely seen their fair share of bill shock there, where, the costs can spiral out of control quickly. And, containers came in and said, containers are lightweight, and, it hardly costs as much, to spin up containers and all of that. It's really quick. You can just run it for short lifespans. So, there was this kind of promise that, containers can actually really cut your costs compared to VMs. But, I think with Kubernetes, the kind of scale we're seeing of containers is so much that, it probably is another myth, that is probably prevalent in the industry. And if you could talk a bit more to that, the myth of, containers being more inexpensive, more cost effective than VMs, or that Kubernetes is less expensive than your traditional AWS EC2 instances. Could you talk a bit on those lines?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like with every new technology, we kind of we run into this paradigm, right? Like when the cloud first came out, that's what it was. It's like, oh, if you move all of your stuff to AWS, it's cheaper. It's like,
Mhm.
well, it's cheaper if you take advantage of the flexibility, right? Like if you have, a set amount of hardware in your physical data center, and then you go and essentially lease that same hardware from AWS directly, that's going to be more expensive. Like the
Mhm.
flexibility comes into play to help reduce that cost. If you are, again, back then it was the same thing. If you're scaling horizontally when you need additional compute and you've written your code so that it can be, it's been transformed and it can run in a stateless type environment where you can just add replicas of your EC2 instance when you need to and then pull them back when you don't need them. And with containers, it really is the same thing. If you're picking up like a legacy code base and just dropping it straight into a container and then sending it to the cloud and saying, "Hey, this isn't my problem anymore," you're gonna have bill shock at the end of the month, right? Like you're not gonna be happy with what you see. And we find that it continues to be like it's just this every single stage we go through, there's this additional complexity that it takes to really take advantage of that capability to be more flexible and that capability to run a cheaper environment, right? And that's kind of one of the things that we're seeking to help solve for is that complexity gap. So if you take your code and you pick it up and you drop it into Kubernetes, but you're not really sure how to configure it, and maybe you over provision your resources, you're going to end up spending more money than you would have if you were just running it on an EC2 instance. But at that same time, if you know how to correctly size your pods and you know how to configure it so that you're bursting out compute through the HPA when you need to, and then the system is dynamically bringing that back down when your traffic comes back down, like that's how you hug the curve of usage. And that's how you keep a cost of goods sold as low as possible when it comes to managing your infrastructure so that you can unlock that additional profitability. But the biggest thing for me too, frankly, and the reason why I was really excited about StormForge is because it's not just the cost for me. It's cloud waste is a serious problem that actually contributes carbon emissions into our environment. It's something like 7 to 8% of all electricity consumed across the world is spent on data centers. Because
Oh,
after
okay.
all, the cloud containers, AWS, like it's just somebody else's computer, right? And
Mhm.
so it's easy to abstract that away when I don't have to see that.
Mhm.
But to think about the amount of waste because people are over provisioning Kubernetes environments and the number of servers that are sitting there churning, like frankly, not doing anything because your CPU idle is at 98% and you're only using 2% of your capacity. It kind of gives me a little bit of heartburn. And that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about and why I'm really excited to be with StormForge to help solve some of those problems.
Really interesting. Wow. Could you tell us an example without naming a company of, an example of a company that was running up its cloud bill, really high because of badly managed Kubernetes,
Mhm.
what you saw, and if you could even at the end of it tack on some, low hanging fruits for someone who's listening and says, I want to start somewhere, uh, you know, where do I start optimizing my Kubernetes? And we'll get into the StormForge part after this, but if you just talk
Yeah.
a bit more before we get into StormForge about just an example of what you've seen and some low-hanging fruits of what can be done to fix those kind of
Yeah.
issues.
Absolutely. The first one for me, and it's really interesting because when I was at the enterprise and we looked at like our whether it's EC2 usage or Kubernetes usage, we monitored a lot of telemetry within the site reliability engineering group that I ran, and one of the things that we looked at, obviously a key metric we monitor is CPU. And so it's funny because it actually does require a little bit of a mind shift. Because back then, when I looked at a chart of like CPU idle, and like I said, if it was down at 2%, like I would always view that as a good thing. And it's like, great, I have plenty of room that I can burst up. Like if we get additional traffic, like this is perfect, it's fantastic. But what I never really considered was that 98% that was idle was just wasted compute that I'm paying for, regardless if I use it or not. And there's been a couple customers. In fact, we have our design partner on this release that we just launched on the 27th for around supporting bidimensional scaling. They ran into this problem. They moved from EC2 into Kubernetes because they realized their company primarily did basically corporate messaging, where you could send a message to employees. It was a distributed platform, obviously very bursty workloads. And so on EC2 instances, they had a lot of just idle compute sitting around. And so by moving to Kubernetes, their hope was to be able to then burst into that with the HPA as necessary. And so they designed their deployments around leveraging the HPA. But the configuration is so complicated that they ran into issues trying to figure out how to right size the base pod that they were using, the amount of CPU memory that they attached to it, and then also figuring out at what point do we trigger a scale up event, and then at what point do we trigger a scale down event? Like what is our target CPU utilization that we should be going for that takes into account mean time to scale and everything else? Because if you're sending, corporate messages to your employees, some of those are really important messages and you need to ensure a really high delivery rate. And so because of that, they leveraged a very high compute and memory base for their pods. And they leveraged the HPA, but their scale point was so low that they were just constantly scaling up and then scaling back down and not actually taking advantage of that compute that they were using. And so they paid for it. And so I remember specifically within our first POC, I think our average savings that we found for them was something like 60%. It was absolutely crazy. And so yeah, they leaned in heavily and they're like, we're all in, like we can't wait to move forward with this. And they've been a design partner ever since as we help them solve this problem. But it's, as far as configuration goes, it really takes performance testing, it takes monitoring your traffic and making sure that you're considering not just what is the size of compute that I'm deploying on each individual application, because each one is different, but then also depending on how that application behaves under load, when should that application scale? And I think that's the challenge, is that I don't know of a lot of SREs or software engineers that come into work and say, oh, I can't wait to tune this Kubernetes application, right? And then when you take a look at that and you focus on trying to do it for one, but then having to multiply that across 100, it very quickly becomes a problem. There's a lot of really talented people that can do this, but like I said, just the hours in the day that it takes to do it correctly across multiple applications very quickly becomes overwhelming.
All right. Yeah, great. That really brings it home, that example. And I'd like to segue into just talking about StormForge and what you do at StormForge. So if you could just give us the elevator pitch of StormForge. You mentioned its mission earlier. So if you could just give us an intro, what does StormForge do to solve all of these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. So StormForge, basically we apply machine learning algorithms to a user's telemetry data to determine both what should the vertical size of a pod be, so what should your CPU and memory configuration be, but then if you are using the HPA, we actually automatically take that into consideration because we can detect if an HPA is on or not. And then as part of that, we also make recommendations for where your scale point should be with that HPA configuration to make sure that you're essentially hugging the curve of usage as tightly as you can. And that's what maintains not only peak performance and reliability, but that's also how you reduce cloud waste in your organization. And so the advantage there is that you no longer have to have human beings that are watching your systems and manually trying to tweak and tune and configure, because there have been studies where the most number of variables that we can really consider as we're looking at something like this is 4. And when you look at Kubernetes, and especially in a lower environment, when you're trying to configure an application to run on Kubernetes, very quickly that gets into the 50 to 60 different configuration variables that go into each different application that you're deploying. And then by the time you have 100 different applications you're deploying into Kubernetes, it stacks up very quickly. And so we actually take what should be on the surface, it feels like the HPA and the VPA, right? Autoscaler is right there in the name. Why isn't it automatic? We basically unlock that and we allow it to be automatic. So all you do is deploy our system in your environment. We can do it across your entire cluster, whether you've got 50 namespaces that you want to tune or 10,000. And we reduce that toil to save money on the cloud bill that you're paying for today. But then, like I said, reduce carbon emissions is the thing that's really, really drives me and makes me excited about the work that we do.
Really cool. So how does it actually work in practice? So when you get an alert, let's say that you over provisioned on compute capacity on these instances, how does it work? So do you have a way from the StormForge interface itself, the UI, to be able to change that? Or
Yeah.
do you need to just see that alert and then go to your AWS or wherever and make the change there?
Yeah, so that's kind of what sets our capability apart when you compare it to some of the other competitors that are out there. Like there are plenty of vendors that will show you like how much you're spending in a particular namespace, and they'll flag the ones where you have like high compute usage, for instance. The problem is though, that doesn't really tell you anything other than like, that's a big application, right? It doesn't tell you if it's the
Okay.
correct configuration or not.
Mhm.
What we do is we actually take all of that telemetry and observability data and we turn it into actionability. Like we can actually take automated actions on your behalf. Part of our
Okay.
tool includes plugging into your Kube controller that's running in your environment. And if you choose to enable it, we can automatically make those adjustments on the fly every hour if you wanted us to.
Wow.
Because it's one of those things where, you know, as an SRE, I believe that every time you do a code release, you should do another performance test. So same thing with StormForge, right? Every time you push code to your environment, we need to reanalyze that and make sure that you still have the correct amount of CPU and memory and that your HPA is still configured correctly. So we do enable full automation. Just click a button. You don't have to touch it ever again. And then
Wow.
all the way back down to within our UI, like you kind of suggested, we will show you the recommendation that we make. And then there's a button in the UI. If you want to do manual mode, you can click approve recommendation, and then our system will deploy it for you. And then everywhere in between as well. If you have a CI/CD pipeline that you want to plug us into and query us to say, hey, I'm going to deploy this app again, what configuration should I use? All of it works. And I've actually been very surprised because a lot of our really large enterprise customers, like with my SRE hat, I didn't think that, you know, maybe people would use the automatic mode. I thought that they would want to click approve. But then when I think about it, you know, deploying into 10,000 namespaces where we're making recommendations for you, that's a lot of approve buttons to click. And so it makes perfect sense that actually some of our largest customers, they just want full on automatic mode, like deploy it and let me know if there's anything I need to do, right? And they've had a lot of success, and they really enjoy the tool, which is fantastic. That's what I like to hear.
Yeah, that's impressive. Quite fascinating. If you could give us some examples of some of these automated actions that StormForge can take. Yeah, so we get an idea what are some of the different
Yeah,
things that it can optimize.
yeah, absolutely. So at its core, when we're talking about optimization in production, the two metrics that we look most closely at are CPU and memory.
Okay.
So we will look at your current CPU usage within your container.
Mm-hmm.
And then the machine learning system, it's not just like that point in time CPU in
Mm-hmm.
memory either. Like we actually look backwards up to 2 weeks. So if you have an application and you're using one of our partners, so Datadog is one of the systems that we just recently announced a really big partnership with. And that's something that's really exciting for me, because if you're a Datadog customer, we can deploy into your environment, like say today, then look retroactively at your last 2 weeks worth of telemetry data from your production environment. And then within 2 to 3 hours, we will have a machine learning recommendation for the configuration of your application that's based on 2 weeks of data, which is just absolutely fantastic. And then as part of that, like I said, if we detect that you have the HPA enabled for your application, because it is automatic, you don't have to tell us, that will actually influence the size of the pod recommendations that we make, because we take that into account with our machine learning algorithms. And then in addition to that, the machine learning algorithms will also make a recommendation and a configuration change for the scale point or your target CPU utilization that the HPA is leveraging to determine when to add pods and when to reduce them. So like I said, it is fully automatic, and with production right now, it's primarily CPU and memory, which is great, because if you read the documentation today that Google or even Kubernetes themselves put out, they actually explicitly tell you not to use the VPA and HPA together on the default metrics of CPU, because it will cause thrashing. And so that's the thing that's most exciting for our system, is that we can enable that for you, because as your production workload scales up, it's not a one-to-one relationship. As you add additional, you know, replicas, depending on how your code performs, there's certainly a law of diminishing returns here, depending on how your application behaves when it's got 50,000 requests versus, you know, 10,000 customer requests.
Mm-hmm. Wow, sounds awesome. Can you take us a bit behind the scenes of StormForge? What happened? What are the components you are? Rather, how does this work? Is there an agent that sits in AWS? You're obviously connecting with Datadog and
Mm-hmm.
getting telemetry data from there. But yeah, just give us a picture of what's happening behind the scenes from what you just explained.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that it works is we actually deploy a couple of additional pods into your namespace in our StormForge system namespace. And so one of the things that we're really passionate about, because we have a lot of customers that have sensitive data and sensitive Kubernetes workloads, We today don't ship data out of your environment aside from the recommendation that we're making so that we can display that to you in the UI and that you can improve it. Right now, our recommender engine, and then we spin up a separate little time series database that's based on Prometheus, where our recommender agent basically queries the data to make those recommendations. All of that stays within the customer's namespace today. So that way, even if you wanted to, you wouldn't even have to connect to our UI. We actually do have an air-gapped solution where we can run this in an air-gapped cluster as well. And then you can approve everything from within your own cluster, so it doesn't even have to leave and connect to the internet at all. It's been a really powerful system, and it's been great because while we do consume just a little bit of extra CPU and memory within each namespace we deploy into, the CPU and memory savings that we provide for a customer far exceeds anything that we consume as part of our recommendation engine.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Wow. So last question on StormForge, and I want to just ask a bit about your release today, the bidimensional analysis and recommendation. Why is this so special? So how was StormForge doing optimization before today, and what changes today?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I just mentioned, prior to today and our launch today, even Google themselves said you cannot run the VPA and HPA together because they will cause thrashing. They will essentially fight each other. And it just has catastrophic consequences if you have them both enabled. And I think that's a big lead into why, like I said, going back to one of the statistics I shared earlier, only 1% of users of Kubernetes today use the VPA. It's either the HPA or nothing at all. And they just deploy these massive containers into production, which ends up contributing to cloud waste and that bill shock that we talked about. So with the announcement today, though, like I said, our machine learning algorithm can now detect if you have the HPA enabled, and that will actually influence the recommendation that it makes for the verticality of your pod size. But then also we tell you exactly what scale point to use with the HPA designed for that pod size that we're recommending in your environment. And then with automatic mode enabled, like I said, we can automatically deploy that for you. It's one of my personal beliefs that, there's a couple indicators if you're configured correctly or not. And a big one for me is if you have the HPA enabled, but it's never completing a scaling action, then your pod size is probably too big, right? And then the inverse of that is also true. If you have the HPA enabled and it's just constantly scaling up and scaling down every 30 seconds, then your verticality of your pod size is probably too small. And so you're probably having customer impacts there. And so that's the thing that we're able to do now is we can find that perfect configuration for you with the HPA enabled to make sure that we're maximizing the scale and the slack within your environment to reduce as much of that cloud waste that we can.
All right. Wow. So everyone watching, if this really interests you, bidimensional scaling, go and check out what StormForge is up to. Check out this new feature that they just released today and learn more about it. So with that, we're winding down. I have just the last couple of few questions to get to know Pat a little better. So yeah, Pat, just got about 5 questions, fun ones.
Only 5. Good deal.
So let's go. So your alternate career path, if not for your career in tech?
Ooh, really good question. I think there's probably 2. So fun fact for me, I actually have a degree in golf course management from Iowa State University. So if I was not in tech, I would probably be out building golf courses because I love operating heavy machinery. It's a lot of fun. And then also, my wife actually runs several small retail stores in downtown in my hometown in Iowa. Cool. So if I wasn't in tech, I gotta imagine that she would drag me down to the store to run the cash register for her every day.
Cool. Wow, I didn't know there was a course on golf course building, but yeah. Which is your favorite part of the whole process of building a golf course?
Oh man, probably running the excavators. Like those are a lot of fun. But honestly, though, like there's a couple different things. It's one thing because normally we would obviously pay big construction firms to come in and grade all the dirt for us and get the rough layout. Building the greens was always really fun though, because that's something that we did ourselves. So like the excavators would basically dig a pit that's like 18 inches deep of where the green would be. And then if we were doing a California style green, like we lay our irrigation and then a dump truck comes in and dumps, 20 tons of sand. And then we get our little skid loaders and everything and shape the green to like get all the undulations, how the architect designed it. And that's the first step where it really starts to look like something. And then the 2 to 3 weeks after we plant seed in the fall, when the sprouts start to come up and everything starts to turn from black and gray to green, is really exciting. And then that first mow is always really fun too.
Wow. Sounds really interesting. I probably want to do another whole podcast on this itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah. Well, a bit about just you as a, as a programmer. What was the moment when you realized you're going to be a programmer, developer?
It's a really great question. It was, I think, so one of my first jobs in tech, which I think this is a common story, but I did client facing like a help desk at a retail service, right? So customers would bring in their computer and they would drop it off and we would fix it. And there were a couple things where I realized that this was something I was passionate about, especially when it came to problem solving. One was we had so in this particular city, there was a university that had its own help desk that college students would take their computer to. And I remember this one student in particular, she was working on her PhD thesis, and she took it into that location because she had a virus, I think. And so they did a data backup for her and they said that they removed the virus and they gave it back to her. But then when she turned her computer on, it wouldn't do anything. She couldn't get it to turn on. She couldn't do anything. And this was, 20 years ago. And so it was like all the, the SCSI hard drives and everything else. And so I popped the side of her case open on her desktop and she had 2 hard drives, which was common back then. You'd have one for your operating system and then one for all your storage. And I realized that when they put her computer back together after the data backup, they swapped the hard drives. They swapped the master and the slave drives around. And so the computer wouldn't boot. And so it took me 30 seconds. I just swapped those drives back, put the ribbon cables back in, turned the computer on, and everything was fine. And just the sheer like relief and joy that she expressed was like, that was the moment where I'm just like, this is awesome. This is great.
I'm good.
And then from there, it kind of progressed. Like I got really good at removing viruses by hand. And then there were a couple of situations where my name is actually on the release notes for a Netgear router from like, I think 15 years ago, because Netgear published a firmware update. This was when they first introduced wireless isolation mode. And it caused, for whatever reason, it conflicted with UPnP, even if it was disabled. And so I was able to figure that out and troubleshoot it. And weirdly, we figured out that you could enable it and then then disable wireless isolation mode and it would fix it. And so I wrote up a thing and I sent it to Netgear and they published a bug fix and my name is on there, which was just really neat.
Yeah.
And so it's like one of those things where you figured out that like, okay, I could like change a little bit of this code around and I can fix this. And then the thing works better than you expect. And then from there, it just slowly built and became more and more complicated. And then pretty soon, I was working on bestbuy.com and we're handling thousands of requests per second at midnight on Thanksgiving. And like just the scale of the operations it was so much fun. It's so addicting.
All right, cool. The programming language that you're most comfortable with or most familiar with?
Most recently, I would probably say JavaScript and Node.js. I still code today, not every day, but even as CTO, like obviously I'm not the guy that's writing the algorithms, and I don't think I've even done a pull request for any of our products at StormForge yet. So no big deal there. But I do a lot of home automation and all of that is in JavaScript. And so it's really fun to do just these really weird little one-off projects. And, like my blinds are automated now and it's tied to the weather. And so like, I'll go outside or I'll come one year in particular, I think it was last fall, I came upstairs and I think the rule is if it's below 20 degrees Fahrenheit at night, all my blinds will close to trap the heat in. And so I remember coming upstairs after dusk because it was 6 p.m. and in Iowa, it gets dark at like 4 o'clock in the winter and all my blinds were closed. And I just had this moment to myself. I was just like, oh, it's going to be cold tonight. And I was just like, oh, like my blinds are telling me the forecast. This is really interesting and weird. And yeah, tech is just super fun.
Yeah. And, you're a CTO and I want to ask just a bit about what you thought the CTO role would be like maybe way back and what you realize now that it's not, this is the case. Anything on those
Yeah.
lines?
So I think I've always known, or I always had this idea in my head of what it would be, and it's absolutely everything that I imagined. Whether it's talking about architecture and solutioning at a high level, and determining what our product strategy is going to be, and working with our VP of product Yasmin has been so much fun. But for me, I think the thing that I enjoy the most, frankly, is mentoring and leadership. I think there's a lot of folks in tech today that frankly, they're kind of forced into a leadership role that they don't maybe want to be in, and they maybe aren't super successful at. And I think that a lot of that has shifted and started to change the last couple of years, especially now that we have, individual contributor roles like principal and senior principal and fellow, which those are relatively new, right? That's new within the last decade or 12 years or so. And it's really encouraging to see that. And I think the thing that I realized early on, and I knew this was the type of CTO that I wanted to be, was just kind of that servant leadership and taking that servant leader role. And that's the thing for me that I think more CTOs should be doing, frankly. Like, I view my job as being somebody who unblocks other people and enables other people to be their best at work every day. And I knew that's exactly what I wanted to do going into it, whether that was, as a manager at Best Buy or a VP at UHG or now CTO at StormForge. And I think that's something that I would encourage other leaders to do as they come into these roles, right? Like, you're not a boss, you're not a manager, you're a leader. And that's drastically different, because it's all about enabling the people that work for you and making sure that they're showing up to be their best every day and doing everything that you can to help them do that.
Some profound words there. I think, servant leadership. I think another idea for another podcast, just life as a CTO. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, I love talking about leadership theory and how you enable other people. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So last question for today. One book or person or course that shaped your early years as a programmer?
As a programmer, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have an answer for that, honestly. The first time that I really got into it was when I was at Best Buy professionally. And so I had a leader there by the name of Ben Hymans, who was my manager when I first started working on the website of the house. And he's really one of the ones that kind of taught me the whole servant leadership idea. And he just enabled me to do whatever I wanted to try to grow myself, because he knew that would ultimately grow the business, which I was really appreciative of that. And then the CEO at the time that I left of Best Buy as well, Hubert Joly, he actually has a great book around leadership and business in particular called The Heart of Business, which is absolutely a book that I recommend for leaders and people that are aspiring to be a leader.
All right. Wow. Really fantastic responses. It was just a pleasure talking to you, Pat. Thanks so much for just sharing so generously from all of your experience, your insights. There was so much to take away.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Where can our viewers find you online?
So they can find me on Twitter at I am Patrick B, and you can also find me on LinkedIn, although you might have to search for it. And then you can learn more about StormForge at stormforge.io. And we have a free trial where you can check out the latest version of our software there and download it and play around with it. And obviously, we'd love to give anybody a demo. And then we will have a booth at KubeCon North America in Detroit here at the end of the month as well. So feel free to seek me out. Like, I love talking about leadership. I love talking about tech and Kubernetes and everything else. So come find us, book some time with us. And yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation.
Great. All right, our viewers, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you really enjoyed listening in on this conversation with Pat. And do tune in again as we talk to many more people. We actually have a couple of more guests from StormForge itself that will be joining us in just the next few episodes. So do stay tuned and follow the discussion here. So head over to amazic.com and all of this will go up there. So that's where you want to go for all of the updates. Pat mentioned that the KubeCon is coming up, and we'll be covering that as well on amazic.com. We also have a bunch of articles on different topics, StormForge included. So head over there, and it's definitely the place you want to be to really get caught up on all the latest. So with that, I'd like to sign off. Thank you, Pat, once again for joining us. It was a pleasure talking.
Thanks for having me.